Welcome to Judaism Demystified, a podcast for the perplexed. Join us as we explore some of the most fascinating Jewish and Torah-related topics with our esteemed guests. By tackling some of the biggest questions you likely won't find addressed elsewhere, we aim to shed light on important issues and inspire a return to the fundamentals. Enjoy the show. Thank you for joining the Judaism Demystified podcast. It is an honor to have Dr. Yael Ziegler. We are so pleased to have you on. Big fans of your work. Before we begin, we'd like you to first tell our audience a little bit about yourself and your background.
Okay, great. Thank you for having me. It's very nice to meet both of you, Ben and Benzi. I am originally from Philadelphia, many years ago. I went to Stern College in the late 80s, early 90s. And then I made Aliyah. I met my husband in Israel. We moved to Alon Shvut. My husband was affiliated with the Har Etzion Yeshiva, also known as the Gush. And we've been living in Alon Shvut ever since. We, thank God, have 5 children. I now, as of this year, have a grandson as well. And thank you. And I've been teaching Tanakh for many years. I got my doctorate at Bar Ilan somewhere along the way of having children. And I taught for many years in the midrashot system, right, in the different seminaries and to different American students who came for the year. I taught for those years. I taught in English. I always taught Tanakh. That was always the field that I was teaching, even though when I was in Stern College, I concentrated more, I think, on Torah Sheba'al Peh, which was something that I didn't actually have the opportunity to learn when I was in high school in Philadelphia. That was not an option. They did not teach the girls Torah Sheba'al Peh. So when I was in Stern, that's what I focused on. And eventually, when I got to Bar Ilan, I focused on Tanakh. And I studied also at Matan and have been teaching at Matan ever since. And about 20 years ago, I shifted from teaching in English in the seminaries to teaching in Hebrew at Herzog College, which is an academic institution. We give BAs and MAs, but it's also, I think, kind of a good place for me because it represents kind of a midpoint between the world of academia and the world of the Beit Midrash. And that's pretty much where I want to be. That's where I find myself. That's the kind of teaching that I'm trying to do. And so the 2 places where I teach today are Herzog College and Matan. At Matan, I have adult students for the most part. Completely adult students, a range of ages, and it's all voluntary, all, just for Talmud Torah Lishma, just for the joy of learning Torah. And at Herzog, as I said, I also have adult students who I think get great joy out of learning Torah, I hope, but also end up with degrees. And it's actually the largest religious teaching college in Israel. And so I'm very fortunate, and I feel that, very privileged to be teaching the teachers, because then the Torah goes very widely. So that's really a great privilege in my life.
Amazing. And we believe you're one of the leaders in like the renaissance of Tanakh study in the modern age. So we're very excited to get into your methodology. So which leads us to the first question. Your book of Ruth, if Benzi, you can hold it up. Excellent book. We highly recommend it to everyone. How do you approach your methodology in your reading and teaching in Tanakh?
So I try to look at Tanakh from these 2 perspectives that I had sort of alluded to before. On the one hand, I'm looking at it from the perspective of the Beit Midrash, of the world of the Beit Midrash, the traditional readings of Tanakh. I feel especially I feel an affinity for the Midrash, which we'll talk about soon, I hope. The Midrashic approach, the Midrashic readings, and how the Midrash kind of mines the Tanakh stories and passages for meaning. And at the same time, I try to use some of my academic training and the academic reading that I've done in order to also kind of, try to tease out of the Tanakh its deeper meaning. I'm always looking for the deeper religious meaning of the Tanakh stories, of the Tanakh passages, both by using peshat, the simple meaning, and the tools of literary readings that I encountered in academia, and at the same time trying to balance that with some of the traditional readings.
So can you uh introduce the listeners to the literary method?
Yeah, so the literary method, I think, I think it's familiar to those people who have also learned Midrash, which is one of the reasons that I think that the Midrash speaks to me so much, because I think there's a meeting point between the Midrashic readings and the literary approach. The literary approach is reading the text and paying attention to the small nuances, right? It's a close reading of the text. It's looking at repeated words. It's looking at structure, which I think actually the Midrash does less. It's looking at similarities between different passages, right? Similarities, always using language, right? Language is the tool and the key, I think, to really learning Tanakh the way that the Tanakh it wants to be learned, in my opinion. I mean, maybe that's a little bit of a big thing to say, but I mean, I'll give you an example, right? If the midrash, if the text uses a phrase that it only uses in two places in all of the Tanakh, Eino Omer Ela Hashveni, it is telling us, compare me to this other place, right? And if two characters in Tanakh are described in a similar way, Eino Omer Ela Hashveni, it's telling us there's something similar between these characters. You want to be looking at these similarities almost as clues, right? Clues to help us to read the stories better, more deeply, in a more profound way. And I guess the point that perhaps I should have made first is that I'm looking at the Tanakh as one canonical book, right? So that we have 24 different books, but I'm looking at it as this one kind of canon where all of the books are really in conversation, in dialogue with each other. And that really, I think, gives us both a broader view and allows us to draw from the Tanakh the broader themes of Tanakh, and makes it very meaningful as well.
Another word we could use for this would be intertextuality.
There's a lot of intertextuality and there's a lot of close reading. In other words, you want to be looking also at the individual piece that you're looking at, right? So I don't know, if I'm looking at Ruth Perek Daled, the fourth chapter in Ruth, I'm interested in what are the key words? Is there a structure in the chapter? But I'm also interested in how does this chapter dialogue with the first chapter, right? If I'm looking at the broader book as as a piece in its own right, I want to understand what is the structure of the book of Ruth. And then I want to take a step backward and look at how the book of Ruth fits into the bigger picture of the Tanakh. So there's intertextuality, there's close reading of each section, and then there's a reading of the book as a whole.
And how does this differ from academics? Is the difference the religious meaning that we're inserting into it, or also the methodology itself is not necessarily how academics go about reading the text?
So I'm not sure if it differs in methodology, but certainly the end goal is different. I'm looking for how this book affects me as a Jew, how these readings, help me to understand better what the Tanakh is telling us as religious people in conversation with God, right? With the world around us, and finding our role in this world. So that end goal, I think, probably is not what academia is trying to do. But look, I wouldn't go so far as to say that academia is not looking for meaning. It is looking for meaning. Because, on one level, I think academia is maybe more speaking to the mind, and I'm also looking to speak to the heart. But that's not entirely true about academia. Academia also, I think, even if you're studying other disciplines, I would hope that if you're studying just regular literature, you want to touch people's hearts as well. So that I think maybe would not be a fair definition. But I do think that for me, the end goal is a religious goal. And I never took myself out of the Beit Midrash in that sense. Even when I went to study academia, I always was very interested in using academic methodology in order to get to the religious meaning. I wanted the rigor and the methodology and the kind of precise terminologies that I could find in academic study, and then I wanted to apply it to something that was a little bit more, that was a little bit more religious, let's say.
And how would you respond to critics of this approach in that it doesn't necessarily line up with how our ancient biblical commentators approach the text?
Well, look, ancient biblical commentators are a very wide range, right? There's, I may not be reading the text exactly the way the Rashbam read it, although I do think sometimes I am, right? The Rashbam was very precise about reading each pasuk. Every once in a while, very, very rarely, right? In Shmot Perek Daled, Rashbam offers a broad, sweeping comparison between different biblical characters in different biblical books when he talks about Tzipora, circumcising whoever she circumcises on Moshe's way to Egypt, right? But generally speaking, the Rashbam doesn't offer an intertextual reading. So each parshan, each exegete, and each midrash may offer a bit of a different approach to the biblical text. But largely, I would say I'm doing something, or we're doing something. This whole literary approach to Tanakh is very similar to what the Midrash is trying to do. The Midrash oftentimes, it doesn't use the same terminology, of course, and it often doesn't spell out its methodology. It will kind of give you an idea and then leave you with that idea to try to kind of figure out what they're trying to say there and where they're coming from. And also, sometimes they don't even tell you exactly what their final conclusion is, right? The Midrash tends to be a little bit elliptical about its methodology and its goals. But oftentimes I look at these Midrashim and I say, wow, this Midrash is really cutting to the very heart of what I think the Tanakh is trying to say. And it's doing it in these ways that maybe are pedagogically correct because it's very respectful of its audience, right? The Midrash doesn't spell it out for us in a way that kind of takes all of the work away from those who are reading the Midrash. If you understand what I'm saying, I hope that was clear. But I don't think that what we're doing is very far from the Midrash. The Midrash, for example, was very aware of comparing characters, of repeating words, of extraneous words, of how to do a close reading. I'll give you one example. A couple of years ago, this was actually quite a while ago, I was looking at the Shimshon stories, and I was thinking, Shimshon has so much similarity to David. We have these two figures who fight a lion barehanded, right? Each of them in preparation for a battle with the Plishtim, right? And both of these figures have so much inner confidence that they actually walk around the world unencumbered by conventional weapons, right? They kind of pick up spontaneously whatever weapons they find. And there's such a deep, sense of confidence about each of these figures. So, Shimshon picks up the jawbone of a donkey, and David picks up these smooth stones, and each of them use these kinds of weapons in their battles. And both of them, of course, their weakness is women, right? Both of them almost are kind of undone by their relationships with women. Anyway, when I noticed this, and I said to myself, these stories seem to be, also stories that are kind of also literarily placed at the end of the period of the judges as some kind of figure who could be messianic in the sense that they could lead the people out of the quagmire of the period of the judges. And so I said to myself, there's no way that this is a serious comparison, that the Midrash didn't see. That's kind of always my starting assumption. And so I said, well, I saw this without the Midrash, which is not the usual order of events. Usually I see something in the Midrash and then I go and try to unravel it and figure it out. But this time I saw something and I said, I'm just going to go find it in a Midrash. It was very hard to find because it wasn't the most obvious comparison. And eventually I did find it in a Midrash in Kohelet Rabbah, right? In Parak Aleph, I think it was Midrash 18 in the first chapter of Kohelet Rabbah. And I said, to me, this was it was an important moment because it confirmed that which I often think about the Midrash, which is that the Midrash is just doing such a sensitive reading of the Tanakh that if I find something that seems to be there, it's likely going to be in the Midrash, right? It's not a hard rule, but it's a rule that has worked most of the time.
So what do you make of the midrashim that don't seem to be on the surface like a sensitive reading? Like sometimes it just seems like, what is the connection here? So how do you
Yeah.
how do you approach that?
Yeah, so I'm always asking, that's a really important question because I'm always asking those questions about midrashim, right? Sometimes you see these midrashim and they're so far from the simple meaning of the text, and you say, whoa, where do they come up with that? And where is that coming from? Where is it going also, right? I always want to ask myself, what is the Midrash trying to say about what we call omek pshuto shel mikra, right? The deep, simple meaning of the text, which sometimes seems to conflict with the obvious, simple meaning of the text. So, I'm always going to ask myself two questions. One is, upon what is this Midrash based? Is there a textual sort of takeoff point for this midrash, and more importantly, what is the midrash telling us about kind of a deeper reading of the text itself, right? And by the way, I think even Rashi sometimes will do this sort of thing. Like I'm thinking, for example, of Shmot Parak Bet, where we're introduced to Moshe, right? And Moshe has these two confrontations, right, with someone who's oppressing a weaker figure, right? So the first time he sees the Egyptian man striking the Hebrew man, and he strikes him and buries the Egyptian man in the sand. And then the next day he goes out and he sees these two Hebrew men who are fighting, and he turns to the Rasha, to the evil one, and he says, why are you striking your fellow, right? And this Hebrew man turns to him and says, who made you? Who made you this, judge and officer over me? What, you're going to kill me like you killed the Egyptian? And then the pasuk tells us that Moshe became very afraid and he ran away from Paro, right? He was afraid of being caught. And Rashi there has this amazing comment where he says, I think it's on the word Vayira Moshe, he says, Kipshuto. And then he says, there's a simple meaning. He was afraid. Why was he afraid? He was afraid for his life. And then Rashi says, Umidrasho. But the deeper pshat is, I just took liberties in translating Umidrasho, right? But the midrash is that what was Moshe afraid of? He was afraid because he suddenly understood that maybe Am Yisrael, the nation of Israel, was not worthy of redemption. Right, and then Rashi says the same thing later on in the pasuk when it says that Moshe ran away. So Rashi says, "Kipshuto," right? What did he run away from? He ran away from Paro. And then he says, "Umidrasho." But the deeper pshat meaning is that Moshe ran away because he understood that Am Yisrael was not worthy of being saved. Right, and so I think what Rashi is teaching us there cuts to the heart of what I'm often seeing in midrashim, which is that it's not that midrash is not recognizing that there's a simple meaning in the pasuk. It's that they're showing us that there's a deeper layer of meaning, which really is a deeper layer of what's going on. I mean, people are complex and situations are complex. And if we don't cut to the deeper complexities, we're going to miss some very important points in the different narratives. for example, in that Moshe narrative, we're going to miss the true sense that Moshe is fighting the cause of justice. He's this moral figure that all he cares about is justice. He's not fighting an ethnic battle, right? He's willing to save the Hebrew from the Egyptian, and the Hebrew from the Hebrew, and the Midianite women from the Midianite shepherds, right? His battles are about justice. They are not about ethnicity. And when he sees that the Hebrews are not deserving of his battles for justice, he's done. He leaves them. He was raised by two women. He was born twice, to his Hebrew biological mother, and then he's again born, right, to his Egyptian adoptive mother. And so Moshe is above ethnicity. And when he gives up on the Hebrews, he runs away, and God calls him in the burning bush and says, come back and save the Hebrews. And Moshe objects 5 times, right?
The
So,
midrash.
right. So that's the midrash already preparing us for why Moshe is such it's such a hard sell to get him to come back to Egypt. You would think that for someone who is so motivated by his moral compass, that as soon as God says to him, come back to Egypt, I want to bring the Hebrews out of Egypt, he would say, okay, I'm coming, right? But he doesn't. So that's a very long example, but there are so many. I'll just mention briefly one other example without actually getting into the details.
We love examples. Examples are awesome. Keep going.
Which is, one of the midrashim that has always really, really bothered me, and not just me, I'm going to guess you as well, and maybe some of our listeners as well, is, well, there are certain midrashim that everybody thinks actually is part of the text, and this is one of them, and that is the story of Rachel giving Leah the signs.
Oh yes, of course.
With me on that, I knew I was going to get a good reaction for this one, right? So I mean, it's the very opposite of the story.
And they're fighting the whole time. They're fighting the whole time. It's not sisterly love.
Not at all. And also, it's not just that it's not sisterly love. The words that are used to describe the interactions between Rachel and Leah, who only speak once to each other, and it's in the story of the Judaim, these mandrakes, whatever, and there's so much tension, and you want to take my mandrakes? It isn't enough that you've taken my husband, says Leah to Rachel. And the words that are used, the kina'ah, the sina'ah, the jealousy, the rivalry, the hatred, right? There's the story is laced with so much tension, and not only that, but the tension is so important because it's really the whole story of Tanakh, right? It's the story of their children. The kina'ah and the sina'ah continues in the next generation. The jealousy, the hatred, it continues in the story between Yosef and his brothers. It continues in the story of Beit David and Beit Shaul, right? Beit David being the children of Leah and Beit Shaul being the children of Rachel. It continues in the story of the division between the kingdoms, the northern kingdom, which is Ephraim, which is Beit Rachel, and the southern kingdom, which is Yehudah, which is Beit Leah. And this is part of the story of Tanakh. And of course, the resolution of this story, of the hatred and the rivalry and the tension, is the ultimate goal of Acharit Hayamim, of the end of days. Look at the 11th chapter of Yeshayahu, right? Visara Kinat Ephraim, right? The jealousy of Ephraim will disappear, right? That's the vision of the end of days. It's not a simple place to get to, this kind of peace between siblings, right? It's part of the story of Bereshit. This is the only story that we have of sisters who are in tension, but the story of
Yaakov, it's all
about Cain and Hazal, Ishmael and Yitzchak, Yaakov and Esau. So the story of Bereshit is a story of how difficult it is for human beings, I think, to create peaceable fellowship, right? Not just a family, but a nation. Not just a nation, but between nations, right? This is the story of humankind. And so to take that story and say, oh, no, that's not a story of rivalry. That's a story of love and generosity. And, Rachel was looking out for Leah and didn't want her to be embarrassed. So she gave her the signs. And it really takes the whole story and it turns it on its head. Right. So it's a tough one. And I'm just going to suggest briefly that I struggled with this midrash as a midrash for a long time. In other words, the chasm between the simple meaning, not just of that particular story, but by the way, I will say one other kind of interesting observation, which is that, of course, when brothers fight in Bereshit, it verges on fratricide, on death, right? Sometimes it actually results in death. When sisters fight, it leads to childbirth, right? So that's just an interesting kind of observation as to the differences between those two types of stories. But it doesn't make it any friendlier. It doesn't make it any less fraught, any less of a distressing story. I struggled with this for a long time, and I'm just going to say two things. One is that I think the solution to where the Midrash gets that idea from is in Yirmiyahu Lamed Aleph, is in the 31st chapter of the book of Yirmiyahu, where we have this posthumous appearance by Rachel. Now, of course, in Tanakh, we have very few posthumous appearances. I would say 3, possibly 2, but maybe 3. One is Eliyahu.
Crying over the children?
Another. What?
That she's crying over the children?
Yeah, that Rachel is crying over her children. She comes back, Rachel mivaka al baneha ki einenu, right? And when people make posthumous appearances in Tanakh, Eliyahu, Rachel, and Shmuel, right? Those are 3 possibly posthumous appearances, depending on whether you think that the witch of Endor actually brought Shmuel back or not, which is a source of, it's a debate among the Geonim. But okay, 3 people make posthumous appearances in Tanakh. All of them come back to rectify something that they left unresolved. Okay? Rachel leaves the story unresolved, the story of her sister. And when we see her standing at the side of the road, crying, Al baneha ki einenu, we remember her first and last words in Bereshit, because first and last words are very important in Tanakh when we're talking about the literary method. Rachel's first words are Havali banim ve'im ain meta anochi. Bring me sons, and if not, I am dead. And her last words are, right? She says, Ben Oni, the son of my anguish. So it's banim einenu, children that are not, right? You hear that? Wow. And when she returns, it's kol b'ramani shma, right? A voice is heard from up high, right? Rachel mivaka al baneha ki einenu, her sons, for they are not. But what is she crying about in Yirmiyahu? She seems to be crying about the Judean exile, right? Mamlechet Yehuda, that seems to be the peshat of Yirmiyahu. She's not crying about Mamlechet Ephraim, about her own kingdom. She's crying about the kingdom of Judah, right? Now, the kingdom of Judah has Binyamin as part of that kingdom, but the southern kingdom is the scion of Leah's dynasty, right? And so she is creating some kind of, I think, reconciliation here when she uses her superpower, which is her crying for her children, in order to cry for Leah's children. I'm going to tell you one more thing, and that is that as we continue in that parak, and I'm sorry, I don't have the parak open in front of me at the moment, it says there in the continuation of the parak, Hatzivi lach tziyunim, right? Make for yourself signposts, right? There's those simanim, right? Okay, so there's almost always a textual basis. I hope you follow that. If I haven't,
okay, I just wanted to make sure I understood you. So you're saying that the midrash with the passing the signs is the Chachamim's way of basically telling us that everything you're about to read over here there is a redemption point. And we see that redemption point all the way down. We have to go a lot down, but eventually, when you get to Yirmiyahu, the wording of the way Yirmiyahu brings her crying and the fact that she's crying over Leah's children, that's where it's kind of that's where the midrash, it's the meeting point with the midrash. So they're telling you that you're about to read these two sisters that are going to be in a bitter rivalry and jealousy and but they want you to in a sense search for that reconciliation that's going to happen, and that happens in Yirmiyahu. That's how they saw it, at least, or their cue to be able to say that a redemption happened here.
Yeah, and I think that they're also drawing our attention to the fact that the ultimate goal of the story is to teach us the tikkun, the end, so that they embed it in the very beginning, so that we should understand that the point of the story is not not the actual tension, but that the tension is about teaching us how to create goodwill, even when there's underlying tension. That's the ultimate tikkun.
Brilliant.
I can do this all day.
This
This is what
yeah.
I love
So,
midrash.
do you have off the top of your head? I know we didn't prepare for this, but you brought up Shmuel Hanavi and Eliyahu Hanavi, kind of like where that story kind of there's a loose end that they have to tie up.
Yeah. So look, Eliyahu, I think we know, is quite a harsh figure, right? And even the Midrash says, right? There is a very famous Midrash, actually an early Midrash, which is often quoted because it's a Tanaitic Midrash. It's a Mechilta de Rabbi Ishmael, which talks about three different kinds of prophets. There's the prophet that only wants to represent God. Tovea et kvod ha'av, velo et kvod haben. He only wants to represent God, but he's not particularly interested in representing the people before God. And then there's a Navi who only wants to represent Am Yisrael and isn't particularly interested in representing God's point of view to Am Yisrael. And what is the perfect Navi? The perfect Navi is the balanced Navi, right? The one who wants to represent God to the people and the people to God. He's empathetic to both sides. So the ideal Navi, actually everyone, whenever I ask, who is the ideal Navi, according to this Midrash, everybody says, what do you think?
I would say Shmuel or Moshe.
Shmuel or Moshe? Absolutely. But the actual Navi that the Midrash brings is Yirmiyahu. I won't get into why, because that itself I think is very sort of peculiar. But the example of the Navi who only wants to represent God to the people and is not interested in the perspective of the people to God, he doesn't have empathy for the people, is Eliyahu.
Sure.
Right. And Eliyahu really, I mean, his first words, right, where he says, Chai Hashem, Asher Amadti Lefanav, Chai Hashem Tzvaot, Asher Amadti Lefanav, Imi Yu B'Shanim Ha'ela Talu Matar Ki'im Lefi Devari. I swear by God before whom I stand that there will not be any rain in this time unless I say otherwise, right? That Eliyahu cannot soften his stance. He's the Eliyahu whose first words are about bringing death upon his people, withholding rains from the people. It's so harsh, it's so strict, right? Eliyahu is really a person, a Navi that demands perfection, yeah, and cannot tolerate the foibles and weaknesses of the people. And so ultimately, when God in Perek Yud Tet, when Eliyahu runs away from the people, when he realizes that the people remain their kind of obstinate selves, right? So Eliyahu runs away from the people and he runs into the desert and he finds himself at Chorev, and it's a very Moshe-like moment. And God shows him this great theophany, right? This great revelation. And, he shows him an earthquake and a fire and thunder. And he keeps saying, Lo be'esh Hashem, lo be'ruach Hashem, lo be'rash Hashem, right? And then finally he shows him that small, still voice, right? The cold mama daka, right? And the way the Mama understands it, I think it's a really good reading, is that God is saying to Eliyahu, be softer. God is not just found in destructive elements. And of course, that whole theophany is surrounded by a conversation, by a dialogue that God has with Eliyahu, where God says to Eliyahu, Ma ta'osefo Eliyahu? What are you doing here, Eliyahu? The Malbim says, why are you not with the people? Why did you run away from the people? And Eliyahu says, Kano kaneti la Hashem, ve'ivater anochi levadi navi la Hashem. Right? The people are worshiping idols, and I'm zealous for God, and I'm the only one left. And then after God shows him this small, still voice, he turns to Eliyahu and he says, Ma ta'osefo Eliyahu? Really, what are you doing here, Eliyahu? And Eliyahu repeats word for word, verbatim, his previous response. And you know what God says to him after that? He says, go and appoint Elisha linavi tachtecha. Yeah. And Rashi says he fires him. Yeah. He says, Rashi says, midrash, right? In the wake of the midrash, Rashi says, you can't soften your position. So then you can't be the Navi. If you can't represent the people's perspective, if you can't have empathy, if you can't soften a little bit, so then then you can't continue to be the Navi. And so he points Elisha. Elisha is in this sense quite different than Eliyahu. Think of their names. Eliyahu, that is Eliyahu. My God is God. Elisha, my God is a God of Yeshua. For the most part, except for the moment with the bears, for the most part, Elisha walks around the world doing acts of kindness, of compassion. He shows a different side to God, with the exception of the bears. Everybody gets upset about the bears.
Yeah,
I won't get into that now.
That's another podcast right there.
Yeah, that's another podcast. All of these things are really another podcast. But think about it. When Eliyahu comes back, right? When he makes his posthumous appearance, right? At the end of Malachi, Hine anochi sholech lachem et Eliyah hanavi lifnei bo yom Hashem hagadol v'hanora, right? I'm going to send you Eliyahu to bring the good news of Geulah. And that's the Eliyahu that most Jews know, right? The Eliyahu that I'm describing of the Tanakh, of Melachim, Aleph, Perek Yud Zayin, until Melachim Bet, Perek Bet, when he disappears, right? Or when he is taken up to the heavens in a chariot of fire, right? The Eliyahu that most people know is the gentle Eliyahu, the one who has to come back and go to the Brit Milah and bring the words of Geulah, and the Eliyahu of Havdalah, the Eliyahu of the Haftarah, the Eliyahu of benching, the Eliyahu who brings us Bisarot, Tovot, Yeshuot, V'Nechamot. That's a different Eliyahu. And the Midrash actually says about this Eliyahu, why does Eliyahu have to come to every Brit Milah? Because he said, I skipped these words before when I was sort of mangling that dialogue between Eliyahu and God, when God says to Eliyahu, Mata Osefo Eliyahu. Eliyahu says, Kano kaneti la Hashem Elokecha, right? And then he describes Am Yisrael and he says, Ve'et britcha azavu, something like that, right? They left your brit. And God says to Eliyahu in the Midrash, you claim that Am Yisrael left my brit, chayecha, by your life, you will have to go to every Brit Milah and see that it is not true. That's a lot of bagels that he has to eat. It's a bit of a right. It's a bit of a punishment. Yeah. Now I like bagels, but the point is that there's a corrective that's going on here according to the Midrash, and I think that's his posthumous appearance.
I think the beauty of that the part that you tied in about the Brit Milah and Havdalah, these are all the times that we proclaim our loyalty to Hashem, which he didn't think we could do. But it's not just a cautionary tale. Oh, this is Eliyahu Navi's punishment, but it's also a reminder for us as people. Like every time we have these celebrations, we're like, remember what Eliyahu thought about us, and it's kind of it's also a reminder for us, not just for Eliyahu. But yeah. There's one thing I wanted to go back to, which I think was very important point that you made when you brought up the whole Rashi on the beginning with Moshe Rabbeinu. I think the misconception a lot of people have is that they'll think that the Midrash is, when it says like this is the deeper idea, is that it's replacing the peshat. And it's saying, no, this is the actual meaning. And that's not the case. What you were trying to say, and I think you said it very well, is that both things can be true, that there are multiple layers of truth that the Midrash is coming to reveal, because otherwise we might just be, we might just accept one idea just because that's a simple view. But that's not how life works. When you see in an action, you have the Midrash is trying to alert us to the fact that there could be multiple ideas here. There's truth can be expressed in many ways. Truth can be
Yeah.
expressed through stories, through literature, through art, through poetry. So this is just, to me, I think a very big misconception. It's unfortunate, but I think that Midrash is misunderstood often because of this.
I think that's an excellent point, and I think it's exactly Rashi's point. It's not my point per se; it's Rashi's point. He brings both in order to show us that both are true at the same time. And I would even take that point a little bit farther and say that the whole range of Masorah, of traditional readings of Tanakh, is teaching us that very point. You can entertain an idea and its opposite, and you can extract from both of those things a really deep and wonderful truth, both of which is Tanakh is trying to reveal to us, even though they contradict each other sometimes. I'll give you a great example for this. I have something particular in mind, which is also in that same chapter in Shemot Perek Bet. Right, so Shemot Perek Bet, where we first meet Moshe, which is such an important chapter because Moshe is, arguably Tanakh's most important figure. I don't know, you could say David also, but certainly in terms of the amount of attention that Moshe has given, right? So, in that first chapter that we meet him, that's really a critical moment for understanding this seminal biblical figure. And in the first part of the story, the first 10 verses of Shemot, of the second chapter of the book of Shemot, are dedicated to Moshe as a baby. Right. And one of the things that I alluded to before is that one of the issues that we kind of have with Moshe as a baby is that he's born twice, right? He's raised by two women. He emerges from his biological womb, and then he emerges from an artificial womb, the teva, right? And two mothers raise him, or sort of determined to save him. And so the question that we are left with at the end of that section is, okay, so who is Moshe when he grows up? How does he identify? And the wonderful thing is that when he emerges from the palace in Pasuk Yud Aleph, right, it says something like Vayhi bayamim hahem vayigdal Moshe vayetze el echav vayar besivlotam vayar ish mitzri makeh ish ivri me'echav. Okay, so I'll translate that pasuk. And it was in those days, and Moshe grew up, and he went out to his brethren, and he saw their sufferings, and he saw an Egyptian man striking a Hebrew man from his brethren. Now, Ramban looks at that pasuk and says, how marvelous. Moshe grew up in the Egyptian palace. He had contact with his biological Hebrew mother till the age of maximum 5. Right? Let's say. I mean, we're only speculating, but for the past how many years, we don't know exactly how old he is, but for the past many, many formative years, he's been Egyptian. He dresses Egyptian. His haircut is Egyptian. I know that not from Prince of Egypt, but from the daughters of Reuel, right, who say Ish Mitzri Hitzilanu. They identify him, externally as an Egyptian. But we have every reason to think that he must identify as an Egyptian. So Ramban says, look at this. In the first verse, when he emerges from the palace, the word echav appears twice. What a wonderful, loyalty is being described here that Moshe has towards his Hebrew brethren. So that's a wonderful reading. There's a midrash that adapts that reading also, and I think it's the most obvious reading. But then you look at the Ibn Ezra, and the Ibn Ezra says, I think this is one of the most amazing Ibn Ezras that I know in the Torah, right? So the Ibn Ezra says, no. He does something that is really, I think, very bold exegetically here. He says, no, you have to read it differently. You have to read it as follows. Vayhi bayamim hahem, vayigdal Moshe, vayetze el echav hamitzrim. The first echav, he went out to his brethren, is talking about Moshe going out to meet his Egyptian brethren. That's the Prince of Egypt moment, right? When, I don't know if you saw the movie, right? But when Moshe is coming out of the palace with Ramesses, right? The both of them on on their horses, Ramesses, right? But that's the most obvious reading. But then how do we deal with the rest of the pasuk? Vayar besivlotam. The word sivlotam, actually, from a grammatical perspective, could be passive or active. And he sees their sufferings. That was the way I originally translated the pasuk. That's the way Ramban understands the pasuk. But Ibn Ezra says, no. He saw the sufferings that the Egyptians were imposing on others.
We're handing it
And
out.
you know what happens in the rest of the pasuk? Says the Ibn Ezra, Moshe, mid-verse, switches allegiance. Vayar ish mitzri, makeh ish ivri, me'echav, says the Ibn Ezra, ha'ivrim. For the Ibn Ezra, the two words echav are actually pointing in totally different directions. When Moshe comes out of the palace, his obvious inclination is to regard the Egyptians as his brethren. The minute he sees them causing suffering to another, he no longer wants any part of them. He no longer has any allegiance to them. And mid-sentence, he switches allegiance.
That
So,
goes with the Midrash, though, that we spoke about earlier, that it wasn't an ethnic thing. It was a moral thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
who's right here? The Ramban or the Ibn Ezra? So Ben, it's exactly what you said before. Both are right? They're both wonderful readings. In the first reading, I'm already getting a sense of Moshe's deep loyalty, right? His ability to hold on to loyalties, even when, when it's possible that he might relinquish them, right? In the other reading, I'm really getting, I think, a very accurate portrait of Moshe's his real concern, which is not ethnicity. It's not, oh, I identify with you because you're Egyptian or because you're Hebrew or because you're Midianite. No, I identify with morality. I identify with justice. I am looking for, an ish, right? That's the story there. Now that's why he has to leave Egypt. Vayifen kovacho vayar ki ein ish. Right? He sees that there's no man in Egypt who he can identify with as a person of morality. In my mind, that's why he eventually meets Reuel or Yitro, because that's a person of justice. But that's taking us in a whole different direction. The point that I wanted to make here is that I don't think we have to choose between Ramban's reading of verse 11 in chapter 2 or the Ibn Ezra's reading, even though they're two opposite readings. But they both hold a truth. And I think that one of the beautiful things in learning Tanakh with the really broad range of traditional approaches is that it gives us the ability to see many truths, which I think is part of what we're doing. I mean, let's go to Ruth because ostensibly we started talking about Ruth. Let's go to Ruth and see if we can see some things there. So I'm going to take an example of this is actually an idea that my brother once told me. I think it's a fantastic reading, and I wrote about it in my book. And I always give him credit for it because he told me this idea, and I think it's a great reading of the Midrash. So I'll start by saying that in Megillat Ruth, there's a tremendous amount of what we call in the Midrash. There's a tremendous amount of what we call midrashei shemot, right? Trying to understand the meaning of names. I a little bit did this before with Eliyahu and Elisha, right? We're looking at people's names as part of their essence, who they are, what is their destiny. There's a lot of that in Ruth. I mean, there's a lot of that throughout the Midrash. But I want to say in particular, there's a lot of that in Ruth because I think one of the overriding goals, one of the overarching goals of Ruth is, especially because it's situated in the period of the Judges, which is such a troubling period, is to lahakim shem hamet al nachalato. The goal of Megillat Ruth, one of the most important goals, is to restore names to a family that seems to have lost its moorings, it's lost its ancestral land, it's lost its continuity, right? We're talking about the family of Naomi, the family of Elimelech, and they're about to lose their name because they have no descendant, okay? So the idea of Megillat Ruth is to restore names, but that's very important on a broader level as well, because at the end of the book of Shoftim, the book of Judges, which ends with disaster, right? It ends with just catastrophe. This first period of settlement in the land of Israel ends with, the story of making idols, the story of bloodshed, the collective rape of the concubine of Giv'ah. It ends with civil war. It's a terrible, terrible unraveling of society. But the important point that I think that relates to names is that at the end of the book of Judges, we have 5 chapters of almost completely anonymous figures. Okay, we have an Ish Levi, a Levite man, and his concubine wife, and her father, and the attendant, and the Ephraimite host, and the elders of Yisrael, and the people of Benjamin, and the people of Giv'ah, and lots and lots and lots of anonymous figures in the final 5 chapters of the book of Judges. And what I think that that's describing is a society where people don't see each other as having names, right? It's a society. That's why I call my book From Alienation to Monarchy, right? Alienation is a society where people are alienated from each other. And we know what happens when you look at another person and you take away their name and instead you give them a number, right? That you've dehumanized them. You see them as an object rather than as a subject, and you don't see them as having basic rights, right? The right to food, the right to safety, the right to dignity, the right to lodgings, right? And that's what we have at the end of the book of Judges. So when we look at Ruth as some kind of corrective for the book of Judges, which it is, right? The book of Judges takes us down into a place of Bayamim Ahim Ein Melech B'Yisrael Ish Hayashar Beinav Yaseh. In these days, there was no king of Israel. Everybody did whatever they wanted, which was utter chaos. The book of Ruth takes us to Vishai Holid et David, the last words, the birth of David. There is a king in Israel. There's the possibility of creating order out of this chaos. And the book of Ruth ends with 10 generations of names, right? The Ele Tolda Peretz Holid Chetzor, the Chetzor Holid Ram, the Ram Holid Aminadav, etc., right? It ends with names. We end with the restoration of names. So to go back to the Midrash, which is what you really asked me about, I think the Midrash in really drawing our attention to the names in the book of Ruth, it's telling us this is a book which is really about names. Pay attention to the names. Now, what is the insight that my brother gave me? So the Midrash oftentimes will take a name and it will explain it in a very simple way. Why is her name Naomi? Because Ma'aseha Ne'imim, right? Why is she called Naomi? Because her ways are very na'im. They're very pleasant. Okay, I have no problem with that Midrash. Sometimes the Midrash will take a name and will distort it in a very kind of surprising way. So, for example, this is the example that I think is just a wonderful example, right? So, for example, the name Elimelech, right? So, Elimelech is Naomi's husband, and the Midrash doesn't like him very much, right? For good reason, right? He abandoned the people during the period of a famine, and he went from Beit Lechem, which is, a city in Israel, in the area of Yehuda, of Judah, to Moab, which is like, the spiritual heirs of Sodom and Gomorrah, right? Place that we can't even marry into Moab. Al divar asher lo kidmu etchem belechem uvemayim b'derech b'tzeitchem mitzrayim, right? In Devarim it tells us we can't marry the Moabites because they are distinctly ungenerous. They don't bring us food and water like the people of Sodom, right? Where they came from. So the Midrash asks the question, why is his name Elimelech? Now, Elimelech is a great name, right? It's especially a great name for the period of the Judges, because the period of the Judges is a period when there is no king in Israel, and therefore there is utter chaos. Ein melech b'Yisrael, ish hayashar be'inav yaseh. So if you ask me, why did Elimelech's mother name him Elimelech? I think the answer is obvious. Eli Melech, right? My God is king. I don't need a king. My God is the king, okay? But here's the Midrash. The Midrash says, Lama nikra shmo Elimelech, shehaya omer Elai tavo hamalchut.
Wow.
which is total distortion of the name. Why was he called Elimelech? Because he would walk around saying, "To me shall come the kingship." Not Elimelech, which is a wonderful name, but Eli Hamelucha. To me is the kingship. So so what is the Midrash trying to say? So my brother pointed out, and this is just such an amazing idea, that there is a Masoretic phenomenon. My brother is, I'll just say his name, just to give credit where credit is due. He lives in Baltimore, and he's actually a psychologist. His name is Mordechai Ziegler, Dr. Mordechai Ziegler, and he once pointed out to me that in the third chapter of the book of Ruth, there is a Masoretic phenomenon called a krivelochtiv, something which we read when we are reading from the Megillah, but we don't, it's not written in the Megillah, right? You have a blank space there. So if you are the Baal Koreh, if you're reading the Megillah, you're not going to see any word there at all. But the Tzibor, when they're hearing it, they'll hear you read the word. And there's an identical Masoretic phenomenon that happens twice in the third chapter of the book of Ruth. The first time is when Naomi says to Ruth, "Go down to the threshing floor and, lie down next to Boaz and go all perfumed." It's a pretty sketchy scenario, right? Go down and you'll be perfumed and in a beautiful dress, and you'll lie down, you'll uncover his feet and you'll lie down next to him. And he'll tell you what to do. And it's clearly a seduction scene. The Midrash notes that as well. But how does Ruth respond to Naomi? And she's not thrilled about this. I mean, she's endangering her whole reputation. She's a Moabite. Imagine if someone had looked out of their window and seen Ruth going down all dressed up and perfumed to the threshing floor in the middle of the night. What are they going to think? Well, we know what we think about Moabites, right? They were the ones who seduced Am Yisrael in the 25th chapter of Sefer B'Midbar, right? So they might think badly of her. But she acquiesces to what Naomi told her to do. And she says, "Kol asher tomri Eli e'eseh." Everything you tell me, I will do. And the word Eli is erased from the scroll. That's pasuk Hey, right? That's verse 5. Skip down to pasuk Yud Zayin, to verse 17, when Ruth comes back from the Goren with her 6 barleys, right? And she hands them to Naomi. She quotes Boaz saying something that actually we never see Boaz saying, but that's a separate story. She says to Ruth, Ruth says to Naomi, "Ki amar Eli, al tavoi rekam el chamotech," because Boaz said to me, "Don't come empty-handed to your mother-in-law." Okay, and the word Eli is erased from the scroll. So my brother said to me, "Look at that. Ruth is the one who knows how to take the Eli out of her sentence. What is the formula for good kingship? Is the king who does not see kingship as being for him, but as someone who is everything that they do, right? Everything Ruth does is for the other. It's for Naomi. Why does Elimelech lose kingship? Because he walked around saying, Eli Tavoa Malchut. What is the formula for the Ima Shel Malchut, for the mother of kingship? She knows how to take the Eli out of the sentence. It is such a magnificent understanding of the Midrash. And it's just Shuto Shel HaMidrash, right? But the Midrash, out of respect for its readers, for its learners, doesn't explain it to us. We have to find it on our own.
That is such a brilliant, I mean, like my little tiny hairs that I have left just stood up. So that was really amazing. Amazing.
Yes. So
Wow.
that's credit to my brother who told me that so many years ago, maybe
Wow.
35 years ago, he told me this. And I said, the minute you see this sort of thing, it changes your respect for what the Midrash is doing. It gives you an understanding that the Midrash should never be read just and say, you read it, you say, well, they didn't really read the word Elimelech very accurately, right?
Yeah.
It shows you that you need to always be taking the Midrash just one step deeper.
The key for the most important thing, and I think you displayed this throughout this whole podcast, is that you have to take the one non-negotiable point is we have to take Midrash seriously. We have to take Hazal seriously. If you don't have that starting point, you're not going to get anywhere. If you're reading it just like, they were just, scribbling, just, saying stuff, or, they were out of touch with the psukim, or they were, then you're not going to get anywhere. But when we take the Chachamim seriously, when we realize that the Chachamim were careful readers of the text, and that they were careful about how they presented the Midrash, then we have an avenue to be able to uncover. And I want to appreciate all the different examples and midrashim that you went through in this podcast. It was incredible. I hope it inspires our listeners to really delve into midrash with a different perspective, with a desire to uncover, because I don't know. I listen to this stuff. This is what I love more than anything. Like, I can just sit here and hear midrashim being unpacked and decoded all day, literally. So I really appreciate that you did this for us. And you're a natural teacher, and it shows, and you're passionate, and it shows. You have a love of Torah, and it shows. So
and we want our guests to
we can't appreciate
we want our listeners to get your books.
Lamentations also, yeah.
Lamentations,
Yes,
Tanakh. Amazing stuff. We hope to do this again. And you mentioned your husband briefly, but we would love to have him on as well at some point. You guys are like powerhouse couple. So we're very much thankful that you made the time for us, and we look forward to hopefully doing this again.
Thank you. And I really enjoy talking about the Midrash. And I really appreciate, Benzi, that you understand what I'm trying to do pedagogically as well. I think that sometimes the way that we teach midrashim, or the way that we learn midrashim, could be to the detriment, God forbid, of respect for Hazal. Yeah. And it's really important, just as a teacher who loves Torah and wants my students to appreciate Torah and the tradition that goes along with it, that they appreciate what the Midrash is trying to do. So I appreciate that you were able to, kind of pick up on that point. And I'll just close with one more thought, which is that, we spoke a lot about Midrash, and one of the things that was kind of lying in the backdrop is that to read the Midrash well, you have to be also reading the text well. Yeah. So we kind of colored that with Midrash a lot, but you're not going to be able to understand what the Midrash is trying to do if you're not doing the close literary reading. So it's that combination of the two that I think is really so important for really understanding the Tanakh.
Amazing. That was excellent add on to the end. We look forward to more of your works coming out.
Is there any future? What is the next treat that we get?
So I'm working actually on two projects right now. One is I'm writing on the book of Shemot, which is been coming out on the virtual Beit Midrash, and hopefully will be a book. Mm-hmm. I'm only doing Yetziat Mitzrayim, so the first 15 chapters.
Gotcha.
And I'm working with Erica Brown on an under the line, like a Chamesh Megillot, where we have Perush, kind of extrapolating
like
from our books.
Proper text with commentary.
Exactly.
Commentary instead of essays. I got you.
Exactly. Yeah.
Exciting. Wow, Erica Brown is also we adore her.
We've had her on a few times. She's excellent.
Thank you so much.
She's written on Kohelet and Esther, and I've written on Echan Ruth. So we really only have Shirim to do. Anyway,
that's a fun collaboration. That's a fun collaboration. I'll be sure to be getting all of those. And God willing, hopefully we can talk about it when you bring those books out.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. Chag Sameach.
Sameach.